In 1973, a film was released which was to gain a reputation for being one of the most terrifying cinematic experiences of all time. Tonight, Mark Kermode reassesses Hollywood's powerful encounter with Satan and the forces of evil in Lucifer Rising, 25 years of The Exorcist.
I didn't set out to write a novel that was primarily frightening and then interesting in certain other ways. It was the other way around. So let's have a few scares here, but basically I wanted to keep you on the edge of your seat, to give you a suspenseful psychological thriller in the novel and in the film. But the effect upon audiences astounds me. Needless to say, I have asked many times, many people, why? And it all comes back to a belief and a terror of a real, personal force of evil.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is another world. The world of darkness. One hope, the only hope, The Exorcist.
25 years ago, an extraordinary movie put the fear of God into a generation of cinema goers. I was 11 years old when The Exorcist opened in America on Boxing Day 1973, and I remember vividly the extraordinary reaction it provoked. Some critics called the movie a masterpiece, others branded it a monstrosity. Clerics and clergymen argued heatedly about whether the film was a force for good or evil, whilst welcoming terrified newcomers who flocked to their churches after seeing the film. Wild tales of faintings, vomitings and hysterical audience reactions filled the upmarket newspapers, whilst rumours of a curse on the production haunted the tabloid press. Part contemplative theological tract, part slam-bang horror film, The Exorcist pushed back the boundaries of on-screen thrills with its visceral portrayal of the possession and exorcism of a 12-year-old girl in modern-day Washington, D.C. For some, it was the most effective advert for Catholicism the world had ever seen. For others, like the evangelist Billy Graham, it was an obscenity which carried within its celluloid the mark of the devil. For me, as a kid not old enough to see the film itself, just watching the trailer was a nerve-jangling experience from which I have never fully recovered. The Exorcist was written and produced by William Peter Blatty, a former student of the Jesuitical Georgetown University. Blatty, a Catholic, had wanted to write a factual account of an exorcism which had actually taken place in Mount Rainier in 1949, involving a young boy. When the church declined him permission, he instead wrote a fictional novel in which atheist single mother Chris McNeil turns to two Jesuit priests, Father Merrin and Father Karras, to save her young daughter Reagan from what appears to be demonic possession. Writer and critic Anne Bilson was just one of the millions who encountered Blatty's best-selling book.
I read it shortly before the film came out in early 1970s. And at the time, I haven't read it since, I thought it was unputdownable. I thought it was absolutely terrifying. I was reading it non-stop wherever I was, and I just found it completely terrifying.
For Anne Bilson, the film which Blatty subsequently adapted from his novel was equally startling.
It's the dread, it's the build-up in that. I'm not one of these people who subscribes to the view that less is more in horror films necessarily. It isn't always. Sometimes more is more. Use of sort of symbolism and the idea that something awful is about to happen. The rats, or so-called rats in the attic, I think are really frightening. It's almost a haunted house situation. And haunted house situations, the classic ghost story, actually hinges not on what is seen but what is unseen, and what you can't quite see and what you can't quite make out or qualify.
To the enthusiastically Catholic Blatty, The Exorcist was more than just a damn scary story. For him, it was a theological thriller, a spiritual work which took ancient themes of the battle between good and evil and placed them in a contemporary setting where they'd have relevance for a modern audience. In his story, the transformation of young Regan MacNeil from smiling, peaceful child to vomit-spewing, head-spinning, murderous monster is, ironically, a miracle of sorts. Through Regan's possession, a priest racked with doubt and guilt rediscovers his faith and realises that if demons exist, then so too must God. In writing his novel and subsequent screenplay, Blatty envisaged a higher purpose than entertainment. Not so director William Friedkin, who had just won an Oscar for his gritty action movie The French Connection, and who views The Exorcist in far more down-to-earth terms.
My interest in its validity was almost nil. My interest in its power as a story is what drove the way the film is made. Blatty's perspective is largely derived from being a Catholic and being deeply involved with the mysteries of faith and the tenets of the Catholic Church. And I'm not a Catholic, and I'm only fascinated by it, and I'm somewhat skeptical. But my skepticism ends at a certain point, and his blind acceptance of the articles of faith ends at a certain point, and presumably that's the very same point. That's the point we arrive at where the film is conceived. I approached it first as a damn good story. Unexpected, original, highly original, beautifully drawn characters, short strokes, very clean, precise storytelling.
It was the first big gross-out commercial movie, the first time that special effects were used in such a way, and that it was the film to see. It was the Titanic of its day. Everybody went to see it, whether they liked horror films or not. It struck all sorts of chords then. It probably still does now, especially with people who have sort of religious feelings. I think the thing that was quite shocking about it then, and still is that the fact that all this horrible stuff is happening to a small child, which, however reasonable some of the effects might be, the head spinning and green soup vomiting and so on, it's still quite shocking because it's a 12-year-old girl, and I don't find that very comfortable at all.
It's certainly ucky in many ways. I mean, you hadn't seen projectile vomiting much on the screen before, but now that seems a rather Monty Python aspect to it. One of the conflicts it has as a movie is whether it's a really scary picture or whether it's a serious film about serious issues of faith. And you could argue that maybe neither William Friedkin nor William Peter Blatty ever really decided what they wanted on this. If it's going to be a scary movie, it can lose about an hour of character stuff because it keeps getting out of the room where the scary things are happening. If Wes Craven had made that movie, you would have been in Regan's bedroom for the whole movie. You would never have been let up, and you would come out sort of dripping, cringing, terrified creature. But it seems to me that there was still a need to go away and start talking about crises of faith, issues of society, and all this kind of stuff, which is maybe irrelevant to just a straight, scary horror picture.
Horror writer and critic Kim Newman. There is indeed a pronounced tension within The Exorcist between the serious religious message on the one hand and the more sensationalist scare tactics on the other. In fact, if William Peter Blatty had had his way, there would have been far more overt preaching in the film. But William Friedkin, refusing to make what he called an advert for the Catholic Church, carefully cut Blatty's explicit theological messages from the finished movie, leaving the audience to interpret the film in their own way. One scene which caused particular ructions between writer and director, who had a notoriously volatile relationship anyway, actually had the two priests, played by Jason Miller and Max von Sydow, discussing the meaning of Regan's possession. For Friedkin, it was overstated and unnecessary. For Blatty, it was the very key to his story.
Kara spoke again. We say the demon cannot touch the victim's will. Yes, that is so. That is so. There is no sin. Then what would be the purpose of possession? What's the point? Who can know? Who can really hope to know? Yet I think the demon's target is not the possessed. It is us, the observers, every person in this house. And I think the point is to make us despair, to reject our own humanity, Damien. For I think belief in God is not a matter of reason at all. I think finally it is a matter of love, of accepting the possibility that God could love us.
Billy called me from the Criterion Theater in Manhattan once, after the first release of the film. And you know, he and I and Max had gone around and round and round about putting in that theological scene, which we didn't. And Billy called me from the theater. He said, "Hey, Bill, I'm here watching our movie at the Criterion. You hear them, Bill? There's your religious message, Bill. There's your audience waiting for your religious message. They're all stoned on marijuana and going crazy." Oh, God. Say, can you hear them? They're having a party. Well, maybe it goes that far back.
Does it bother you?
Yeah, it does. It does. I don't like it.
While some audiences did see The Exorcist as merely a roller coaster ride, others were more disturbed, with reports of adverse reactions ranging from sleepless nights to sickness and even self-immolation, leading for calls for the film to be banned. In the UK, The Exorcist is still unavailable on home video because the British censors are so scared of what it might do to younger viewers who get their hands on a copy. Nor has it ever been aired on TV here, despite interest from people like Nick Frean-Jones of BBC Programmes Acquisitions.
In some ways, The Exorcist is very frightening and very shocking, and it kind of, I think it affects you at a certain level, a deep level. But in terms of surface effects and, you know, schlock, gore, whatever, it's very, I'd say, primitive. It's certainly very lightweight compared to some of the horror that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years. But it has a kind of, the way it's shot, the way it's scripted, the way it's performed, it has a kind of, I think, it's a very serious film in a way. It's a kind of adult horror film. A lot of the films we've seen since are clearly aimed at teenagers. That's where the audience lies for this kind of movie traditionally, teenage boys. This is a film that deals with, the themes of good and evil, but in a very mature, I'm not saying it's a boring way, but very mature and very unsettling way, really. And the whole construction of the movie, the construction of the script, the look of the film, it's very, very chilly looking film. It doesn't make concessions to narrative or to character. It's sort of uncompromising. Of course it would be of interest to a modern audience, and it ought to be seen by a modern audience. It's quite mad that you can buy this film, freely in America, and not even be able to rent it here. It is such a legend, it is one of those titles like Straw Dogs, like Clockwork Orange, that has a sort of quality or a significance that's above and beyond, the commonly released pictures.
I think one of the things that underpins The Exorcist's current reputation is based on that old notion that the most fearful thing is fear itself. The fact that The Exorcist has built up this terrifying reputation precisely because it's been unavailable on video for so long is exactly the thing that prevents it from being released and prevents it from being available to us. Most of the young adults I know who've never had the chance to see it are convinced that it would be the most extreme cinematic experience they could have precisely because they haven't had it.
Writer and critic Linda Ruth Williams on the terrifying reputation of The Exorcist, a reputation which horror expert Nigel Floyd finds hard to fathom.
Well, I come at this from a slightly different angle because I never saw the film at the time that it was released. Out of sheer perversity, I didn't bother to go and see it. I saw queues for it. I actually walked past a queue for it and past a Christian guy who was handing out leaflets exhorting me not to go, and went on to see another film. So by the time I saw it, I was very puzzled because I couldn't understand the effect that it had on people. And when I watch it now, it strikes me that it's not actually a horror film as such. I mean, the feelings that it elicits are not horror or terror. It elicits an incredible sense of sympathy for Reagan and her plight, but not in terms of the fight between good and evil, which seems to be taking place in some other abstract metaphysical realm, but just in terms of her actually being the site of this, battle, as it were. I feel, oh my God, this girl's body, this 12-year-old girl's body, is being rent asunder physically. It's being slashed, it's being turned inside out, green bile is being spewed from it. And it's almost like a film about somebody with some awful medical condition. If you don't accept all of the supernatural sort of superstructure and the battle between good and evil and the fact that she is or is not possessed by this demon, you are left with a child actress, immobile, on a bed which shakes about a bit. And this is not, to my mind, something which is calculated to elicit feelings of, say, dread that you might have when watching David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers.
For me, the most interesting moments in the film, and certainly for me the most difficult to watch sequences, aren't anything to do with demon possession, but are all to do with medical intervention and someone being done to and being made to submit to the hideous processes of the hospital tests as Reagan's wheeled around, poked and prodded by medical science, subjected to horrendously brutal scrutiny. She's seen by a doctor, she's given an arteriogram, she's jabbed with needles, she's hypnotised, she's generally medically done too. That's very difficult to watch, and the arteriogram sequence in particular is where most people faint as the needles are jabbed in.
I think on a very basic technical level, Friedkin has done a terrific job. I think that the sound, in particular, is absolutely extraordinary. And there are certain sequences which are just carried by the weirdness of the sound, the unsettling effect that it has, the atmosphere that it creates. The priests will walk into Reagan's room and you see the breath forming because the room has now become icy cold. But what has already alerted you to what's going on in the room is the sound as you came up to the door with the light coming underneath, just where it joins the carpet.
Like the picture, which is a combination of light and dark, the soundtrack is a combination of loud noise and silence, the juxtaposition, the extremes to which the track was put. Sometimes there's absolutely nothing at all on the track, no sound at all. And in those cases, I even had them make that silence out of white leader, not 35mm sound film with nothing on it, but white leader with nothing on it. So that when the track goes dead silent, as it does on several occasions, it comes in contrast to really loud, piercing, profound sounds. I think the music, which I chose from selections from various contemporary classical pieces, is very apt. The music's understated. The music never rises to any peaks until the very end credits, where it asserts itself. But throughout the film, it never asserts itself. I always intended that it be like a cold hand on the back of the neck, a tone, a feeling, rather than a musical sound. And that came out of my own appreciation of dramatic radio when I was a child.
Just as the Exorcist soundtrack has eerie hidden depths, so its apparently theological narrative has also been the source of multiple interpretations in the 25 years since its release. Kim Newman.
I mean, you can interpret Reagan's behavior as just the story of what happens when a troubled adolescent gets really troubled. But in the end, of course, what she's supposed to do is go back to being a nice little girl when the priest comes along and assuages the devil within her. I'm sure there are plenty of American parents in the 1970s who wished that it was possible to take your shaggy-haired, rude, swearing, hair generation hippie-type kid and give them a couple of hours with Max von Sydow chanting at them, and they would come out like sort of Tammy.
It is a film about the monstrosity of gender. The fact that this is a film about a little girl is central. Her gender is not accidental. It's absolutely part of the whole way in which she's demonic, the whole way in which she expresses her diabolism. Certainly in cinema since the early to mid-1970s, the Prince of Darkness has often been figured as a gentleman, but in this film the monstrous is feminine, or more specifically the monstrous is a little girl becoming a ragingly rebellious woman, and of course it takes two grown men to hold her down, one of whom dies of a heart attack and the other one jumps out of a window.
The window out of which Father Damien Karras throws himself at the end of The Exorcist overlooks a precipitous flight of steps down which he tumbles to his death. For Blatty, it's a triumphant moment, with Karras wrestling the demon from Reagan's body and then sacrificing himself and thereby beating the devil. In the novel, this victory is clarified in a sentimental epilogue in which two incidental characters, Father Dyer and Lieutenant Kinderman, meet at the top of those very steps and strike up an unlikely friendship. Friedkin actually shot this ending for the film, but cut it on the advice of Warner executive John Calley, much to Blatty's dismay.
What Bill had written was a kind of a scene for the two of them based on the ending of Casablanca. This is the start of a beautiful friendship. Claude Rains and Humphrey Bogart. Bill put those very words in the mouths of Dyer and Kinderman. And I always had my doubts about the scene, not being able to verbalize why, but then Kelly verbalized why. He said, there's no history to these two guys, therefore the scene has no weight. And he said, to me, the film is over with the guy looking down the stairs.
Something in that epilogue, the original epilogue, told you that everything was really all right. It's going to be all right. Whereas most people interpreted, even those who love the film, the ending as a downer. That Karras had killed himself. It had no redeeming quality in terms of them loving all the shock and the horror and everything that was going on in the film.
In fact, sometime after the film's initial release, Friedkin did find himself wondering whether Blatty hadn't been right, whether he had actually made a mistake in allowing The Exorcist to end on such an abrupt and apparently negative note.
Clearly, a lot of people who've seen The Exorcist feel that the message at the end of it is negative, that the demon triumphs, the demon's set back but not destroyed. I had this idea some time after the film had opened. It might have been a couple of years. And I called Bill about it, and he said, that's great, let's do it. It was to leaving what we have in the film now, Father Dyer looking down the steps, and then as the film exists now, he turns his back on the steps and begins to step away, and the screen goes black. He turns his back on the whole episode, and that's the curtain. I thought it would be wonderful. It might even accomplish more of what Bill felt the thing should have in terms of its spiritual significance if we had a long shot from Father Dyer's point of view of a man coming up the stairs. Not necessarily Karras, but perhaps Karras. And then I had footage of Dyer with a slight smile on his face. And then he turns his back and the film ends. So it would have been the addition of one shot. And I suggested to Warner Brothers that they even advertise that and say, The Exorcist is returning with the addition of one shot. And they went for it at the time. I then went to Georgetown to look at the set, and the stairs, the whole set, had changed so radically that you could never intercut what I was talking about. The steps had been graffitied millions of times over. They were so defaced and debased, and people had ripped boards out of the Mrs. Mahoney's fence that was the house we used next to the stairs.
I first saw the film, I guess, when I was about 13 or so, and I was basically scared out of my mind. And now seeing the steps for the first time, I feel shivers running up and down my back now. I don't know. It's just it's a place of, you know, cult and folklore significance that I don't know, people come and kind of say, wow, I wonder what it's like to actually fall down these steps and have your head turned around backwards, as in the movie. I didn't picture all the graffiti either. Graffiti, you know, maybe people just want to come and say, hey, we're here and we're survived. I don't know.
Just one of the number of teenage fans who gather at the Georgetown steps, which The Exorcist made infamous and which still attract sightseers after 25 years. They come any time of day or night, and I know this because I was one of them. I was one of those people who travelled miles just to walk those steps that I'd seen time and time again in the movie that changed my life. We love The Exorcist, but just where does it stand in the official critical pantheon? Kim Newman.
The Exorcist has several important positions in horror movies. Certainly in terms of the industry of horror films, it's really important because it basically took the formula of the old-fashioned, rather cheap Gothic horror picture. You know, there's the evil bad guy, the devil, and the heroic good guy, the priest, who kills him in the end, which is the same plot as Dracula, for instance, but made it look like a real Hollywood movie rather than a cheap British film. It's a very expensive picture. It's got big stars in it. It has a serious Academy Award-winning director. It's much longer than a Hammer film. They spent more money on it. It made more money. And after that, you couldn't really go back to, Dracula has risen from the grave yet again. Rather more controversial is its position in the artistic development of horror. I would say that it comes at the end of something rather than at the beginning of something. It merely makes explicit what had been implicit in horror all along, the kind of sort of very straight Catholic religious morality that it's bad to do these things, and the devil will get you if you're rude to your mother, which is kind of like the undertone of most classic horror. You know, step out of line and something horrible will happen to you.
So The Exorcist is a classic horror tale in one sense, but does it still have any relevance for a modern audience? Well, we'll find out in April when the film gets a limited re-release in the US, after which, if it plays well, we'll hopefully see it back in British cinemas. Personally, I can't wait for the chance to re-experience the electrifying thrill that I first felt seeing the movie all those years ago, and which still grips me with each subsequent viewing. I can't think of another film which has affected me so profoundly, which has provoked so many contradictory reactions of fear, hope, laughter, terror, and which continues to convince me that there really is magic in the world. Last words to William Peter Blatty and William Friedkin.
The only thing that strikes me about it now is that it seems to be very well made. And occasionally it can move me emotionally. Ellen Burstyn's performance, or the reaction of the little girl when she's in pain and doesn't understand why, will occasionally still get to me. But overall, the everlasting impression, as I see it, is it really works. It's a well-made piece of furniture, let's say. It holds up. You can still use it. You can sit on it, you know, like a good chair, like a Louis XIV chair.
I remember Billy Graham saying the film has a power in it. He wasn't talking about this is a powerful film. He meant there was something of another dimension in the chemistry of that film. He thought it was evil, as I recall, but tremendously powerful and therefore dangerous. And it does have that tremendous power and effect upon audiences today. Today, watching it on home video, it has that effect. So that I have to acknowledge, but I will also make a confession to you. I don't know why. I don't understand it.
Kaleidoscope feature was presented by Mark Kermode and produced by Jerome Weatherald.